Hello, everyone. Welcome to another author interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I am your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. My guest today has made a career of selling his quill as a mercenary writer for many years. For over a decade, he wrote true and important newspapers, magazine, academia, and intelligence analysis for the FBI. Now he writes fantasy stories based on the myths and sagas of the Vikings. His fiction is often influenced by tales lost to time, usually of high adventure, and always the sort that makes readers late for dinner. Outside his time spinning yarns about Vikings and wizards, he teaches judo, brews beer, and plays D&D when he gets the chance. He lives happily with his family in the Pacific Northwest. And also, if you're seeing this video now, you may also remember that I read two of his books in a double feature last week, which were probably some of the best double features I have read on my channel thus far. So let's give a big round of applause to a first timer here on the channel, author Gregory Amato. Greg, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Gabriel.
Awesome, awesome. So before we dive into the questions about your books, Greg, is there anything more you would like to tell the audience about yourself?
Sure. I moved to Oregon in 2010, and that was for the job with the FBI as an intelligence analyst. And I really thought, no more jobs after this. This is my career. I'll finish it out at the FBI. I had had a lot of different kinds of jobs, but all of them really revolved around writing one way or another. There were so many different styles. Academic writing is not like journalism. Journalism is maybe has some relation to intelligence writing, but it's not the same thing by any means, uh, and so on and so forth. So I figured, intelligence writing is the last one. But the thing
Okay.
is, uh, it wasn't the job that I always wanted. The job I always wanted was novelist. And so my careers took a lot of twists and turns to get here, but I don't think that's too uncommon of many other authors, and it definitely describes my journey and how I got here.
Nice. Very, very fascinating. So, speaking of going now to your books, how did you sort of get the idea to write about the Norse myths and fantasy and sort of delve into that side of writing? Because to be honest, I typically don't see like a lot of Norse fantasy stories, a lot in fiction. Like some of them are usually like either on European, medieval Europe, sometimes medieval Arabia, but never truly on Scandinavian history, Norse history. So, how did that come about?
It was a strange path as well. I actually started going back to the way back. I started reading the Norse myths when I was in high school. I was probably 15 years old, and we were reading about Greek myths. And I said, "Well, what about Norse myths? Like, is there an equivalent to Ovid?" We were reading Ovid's Metamorphoses. I was like, "Is there something like this?" And my teacher at the time handed me Kevin Crossley Holland's The Norse Myths, which is not, your definitive translation or anything, but
Right.
it is a very accessible version that is still very strong as far as academic backing. It also has a glossary that is way better than most of the other books that you might read if you're in
Really?
college. It's a great introduction if you don't want to start with like the prose edda or the poetic edda. Crossley Holland's book makes it really easy to get into those myths, and they're written in very accessible ways rather than with this like old style kind of verbiage that might make it a little bit more difficult for people to get into. So I started way back then. I've been reading ever since. To me, it was endlessly fascinating. So I would go deep and read academic journal articles because, like, well, I want to know more about this god or this story or this
Right.
item. And if you want to keep going deep, you do need to access the more difficult texts.
Mm,
Um, Eventually, if you want to keep going deeper, you have to read Old Norse. And I'm not there yet. I know a little bit about Old Norse. I do not read in
right.
Old Norse, though. when I started writing, it was it was I was coming off of a long reading binge. I had really just discovered all these original stories from Robert E. Howard. And if you know Robert E. Howard, sorry, if you know Conan, then you know
Right.
Robert E. Howard. But
Hmm.
he's got other characters as well. I actually really recommend. I've got these books right here. So Del Rey puts out. Let me see if you can get these on camera. Oh, it's reversed, but
Ooh, those are
you get the
nice.
idea. Nice covers. There are 3 books of Conan, but that's not the only character that Howard wrote for Sword and Sorcery. There's Solomon Kane, which
Hmm.
is a traveling Puritan later on, and then there's Bran Mac Morn, the this is my favorite.
Ooh, okay.
So I was reading Sword and Sorcery. I didn't know the difference between Sword and Sorcery and epic fantasy at the time, but what I was thinking was, you have all these wandering warriors having adventures. This is a great idea. But wouldn't it be a better idea to have like a wandering wizard? And so I sat down, I started writing this. I didn't really have a plan because that's what you do as a writer who doesn't know really how to put a novel together. What
Right.
started coming out was this is like 2006, 2007. What started coming out was a strongly irreverent voice and a lot of asides and side stories and explaining what's going on by telling other stories. Those
Right.
stories started going into Norse myths and legends, and eventually I took a break and I thought about it and I realized I was not writing a wandering wizard. I was writing a wandering bard or Norse bard
Ooh,
or
okay.
a skald. And so that was my big aha moment that kind of catalyzed where would I be going with this story? What would the myths be like? What would the world be like that he is living in, and what would he be dealing with? Uh, Now, I didn't really have very good direction beyond that, and a lot of the main characters of the book for a long time, because I wrote maybe 20,000, 30,000 words and then
Hmm.
petered out. Because that's what happens when you don't have a plan is you get
Yeah.
20 or 30,000 words in and you're like, I don't know where this is going.
Where's the story going?
Yeah, I had great characters and I continue to be a very character focused writer, but I didn't know what the plot was yet. I didn't really know what the plot was until I picked it up again in 2018. And then I started getting really serious about it, writing a really rough draft. Uh, Unfortunately, I had an employment issue, the
Hmm.
issue being that I was fully employed and had a lot of energy and life sucking it out of me. So that doesn't leave a lot of energy for writing, especially when your draft is longer than normal, even for a fantasy book, and you're
Right.
trying to square it with, 2 longer books in the series where it will continue to be more and more complex. So, got series in 2018. That's why it wasn't published until 2023.
Ah, okay. Fascinating. So, for those that have never like heard of your books until now, or at least saw the video, I mean, like in a brief overview, what can you tell us about the world of Trollsbane and the beginning of your series of Spear of the Gods? What is the overall world and story mainly about?
Sure. Uh, I have 3 good lines, like standard good lines. I'll give those and then I'll maybe give a little bit more.
Okay.
So imagine the myths, magic, and monsters of the Viking Age are real. A traveling storyteller just wants to get a simple job done and go home. Instead, he joins a famous crew of monster hunting Vikings and has to navigate political intrigue, witches, and a reimagined version of Beowulf's troll.
Ooh, all right. I like it. I like it. Nice.
So Trollsbane is a prequel story. It's my freebie with the newsletter. It's my way of sucking you in.
Right.
It's an early story of the main character who narrates the trilogy Ansgar the Skald. And in Trollsbane we're beginning where he's a little younger. This is like maybe his first delivery attempt where he is delivering weapons from made by his grandfather, who's a really excellent smith. And so he's got to traverse forests, mountains, all the dangers of that, has a few adventures that way. And in Trollsbane, he's got one friend and he runs into a really big problem. And so I keep that as a fairly contained story that you don't have to read in order to get a sense for the first book, but it will kind of introduce you to the world that he lives in.
Right.
And one of the other characters that he interacts with, and maybe some of the dangers that he's going to run into. When we get into Burden to Bear, that's when we really get into the much higher stakes, where he is, again, he delivers some weapon, and then he's got a big problem, and he solves his problem by giving himself a bigger problem, which is joining this crew that he clearly does not belong on. And there, the real saga begins.
Fascinating. And when I was reading Trollsbane and Burn to Bear, I mean, the world building that you already have, it grabs you in, and I really enjoy stories that really captivate the mind, and they really flesh out the world. And being a person that loves history, I typically don't read a lot of stories delving into Norse history or even Norse mythology. So this was like a breath of fresh air for me, and I really do appreciate it. And honestly, I can tell that you've put a lot of work into Trollsbane and Burn to Bear, because they're just so great. The characters feel real. The situations feel organic. It feels that this is not just the mythology. This is literally what happened at the time in this period in Scandinavia. And I love the maps too. I always like books that have maps, because it really does help the reader get an idea of what the world is like. And with all that, when you began going back to it later in your journey, what sort of is the need or desire you want to satisfy for your reader when you got a chance to look at it later in your life?
I think so. I guess we're supposed to think about that beforehand, like as writers, and I didn't calculate that as I was creating. I guess what I was thinking about was I was crafting an adventure, and I think that probably has different meanings for different people, but I knew that was my intent. Like I was going on an adventure myself, writing this, and I wanted to take other people on this adventure. So what the way I see that as adventure is the unexpected, it's the jarring, it's the stuff that changes the way you think. It's not just a guy with a big axe who runs out into the forest, chops some heads, and comes back.
Right.
You go on an adventure, you're not the same hobbit at the end as you were at the beginning.
No.
And I mean, Lord of the Rings was one of my first, and probably it probably influences me in ways I don't even know, because I was just a little kid watching this stuff and then reading the books, and but that sense of adventure mentioned in The Hobbit has always been with me, and I value that sense of adventure, that curiosity, that learning experience very highly. That was something that I really wanted to impart. So I wasn't looking like, well, I want people to feel joy, or I want them to be scared like the trolls or the witches.
Right.
But by the end, I think I want to be in your head, if that makes sense.
Ooh, okay. And what would you say is almost like tying into that was like the promise you're making to a reader who picks up Trollsbane and the rest of the books in your series?
So definitely a sense of adventure, but I think there's really three promises I've never really talked about, made explicit, but as I think about that, I think there are three, and one is authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
You're getting my creations. I don't use any kind of AI. I don't. This is all stuff that I would really want to write.
Right.
I don't write to market. Not that writing to market is necessarily bad, but I don't do it. This is really organic creation for me. Second is professionalism. It's especially important as an indie author, I think, to give a good product, and that means a great
Yes.
cover. It means professional editing. Professional, like you can't have your just friend just edit it. Like
Hmm.
you have to give it to somebody who's going to give it a really good once over. And I also go through multiple stages of editing myself.
Yes.
So when you get it, it should be indistinguishable from, I say indistinguishable from a traditionally published book. I've actually been picking up a lot of traditionally published books and seeing them riddled with typos lately. So whatever your standard is, I want to be at that standard or higher. And the third thing is dedication. Like these are long books. They're hard to write books.
Hmm.
They take a lot of energy, time. The third book is way longer in draft form than I meant it to be, but I'm going to finish it. I envisioned this story as 3 books, and you are definitely going to see me finish that out, even though, frankly, it might be better for my career to write much shorter books and publish more quickly. So when I start that story, I'm going to finish it. I'm going to, I guess, promise that the reader is going to feel satisfied at the end, because that's what I would want. Like that's what I want at the
Right.
end of a series.
And I completely agree. I'm actually glad you brought up those 3 points because, and honestly, Greg, you're probably the first guest that actually brought up like those 3 points, like when it comes to professionalism and like the book itself. And I don't think a lot of my guests have really brought that up. Like for indie authors and our books, there's usually like initially speaking with a lot of authors, the stigma that, oh, it's an indie published book. It's not really as professional as like a traditionally published book. That's not the case. I've met a lot of indie published authors whose works sometimes be traditionally published books, like as you said, they're riddled with typos, they're riddled with like tense changes. So we want to present a book that is going to be on the same level as professionally published or traditionally published, and it's going to have that story that's going to hook the reader in. And I'm 100% agree with everything you said because it is true. It's not just about, oh, the cover is very appealing and it grabs your attention. It's the story, it's the authenticity behind the work, that this is truly a passion project that the author has been working for. And I just got to say, I love that you added the runes in the story. I really thought that was really cool because again, I have not seen anything like that in any other story that I have read even close to that. So I want to give that huge kudos to you, Greg, because that was really, really amazing. And it does go to what you said about being authentic to the story that you're telling and also the promise that you're making to yourself and to the reader that this is going to be the most authentic story that I am presenting to you. And with all that together, when you created the final draft and you finally got Trolls Bane published and Burnt Bear published, what was the initial response like? What was the feedback like?
So feedback has been really positive, which has been very pleasing to me. People have pointed out one element that I kind of was expecting them to point out as good, which is the fighting, individual fight scenes and battle scenes both. But even more people have pointed out the humor that they've really liked, and I was surprised that many people would mention it, because it's doubly interesting because I'm not just getting ratings, I'm getting written reviews
Right.
in a different percentage than I was expecting, because it's much easier to just, drop a star down. I mean, that's what I do most of the time. But when I feel really passionately, especially for another indie author, I write at least a short little thing. When I feel really passionately, I write more than just a short little thing. So if you go into my Goodreads, you'll see there's a particularly long write-up about the Bran Mac Morn compendium from Del Rey. But most people are actually leaving those written reviews, and that goes to a level of motivation that I think is beyond what a new indie writer can reasonably expect. So I've been very positively surprised by that. And I actually wrote a blog post about the humor, breaking that down. It was like, so, it's my sense of humor, but it's actually also the Norse sense of humor. I'm trying to keep that uh, maybe told in a modern way, but at the same time authentic to the way that humor goes. It should be very dry. It should be violent, frankly.
Right. Nice. Very nice. And kind of leading into that, in the response that you got from reviewers, did you get a sense that your promise to your readers that you mentioned earlier and your desire has been validated? That what they're talking about is exactly the goal that you set out when writing your stories?
So I'm not sure if readers will feel the promise has been delivered on until the end of the series, because until then, you're still on an adventure, and Burden to Bear in particular it's more self-contained. It's just the beginning of this character's adventure. I do think people one review said entertaining from beginning to end, and I was like, yes, that's definitely something that I was looking for. uh, will they feel totally fulfilled with by the end of the series? I think so, but I won't really have that until the end. um, a little part of me is also hoping someone writes something like, I never thought Beowulf was interesting until I read your book. But we'll see. That might be too long a shot.
Hey, you never know. You never know. And that's also really cool that everyone is saying all these positive things because you definitely deserve it, Greg. Reading the first few pages of Trolls Bane and also the first book in Spear of the Gods, it does hook you in, as I said in the beginning. It is a great story. The world building is amazing. I love the interaction in the meat hall in A Spear of the Gods. I really enjoyed that interaction where the main character, he's kind of, there's a little bit of spoilers for those who haven't seen the video yet, but the character does get a sense that something's not quite right. Not going to spoil it too much, but definitely watch that video to find out. And it is really fascinating. It feels like those old classic stories again, and I really, really enjoy that. And then you put a lot of labor of love into the story, which then kind of leads into my next set of questions, which is when creating this book and the series, as you mentioned, it is a long process. It is very, in a sense, a lonely process because you are giving hours and hours into this story. You want it to come to fruition. It's going to take everything out of you, the creativeness. You want to give everything to it. And there's always that little bit of dread in the back of every author's mind that it's not always going to resonate with your target audience or the readers. So, with that in mind, what has still motivated you to continue this series? Why do you write?
So I write. The short answer is I write because writing is magic. And if you many of us writers have read Stephen King's On Writing, and I think it's an important book. I don't think it's a model of how you build your writing career at this point, because it's very different now. But
Right.
there's still a lot of good stuff in there, and he describes how writing is magic in there as this means of telepathy over time, where he's like describing this object and you think about it, and then he's like, do you have it in your head? So I wrote this in this year, and you're reading it in this year, and we're both thinking the same thing. I mean, how is that not magic? Now, I think writing is magic for other reasons as well. I wrote nonfiction for the FBI for 12 years, and a lot of nonfiction before that. Now, one of my conclusions has become that nonfiction is not a very effective means for convincing people to take new perspectives. I know that the
Right.
opposite is supposedly true, and a lot of people, probably not anybody watching this video right now, but a lot of people will say, well, I don't read fiction because, I don't have time for that. I only have time for important things like nonfiction. Well, I don't actually think that they're getting that much as much out of nonfiction as they think they are. I think that if you want to change someone's perspective, bring them to a new place as far as new understanding, uh, take them on a journey so that they're not the same hobbit at the end as they were at the
Right.
beginning, you need to write a narrative. And that's much more effective in fiction. And that's the magic of why I write, because that's what I want to do.
And that is probably beautifully said. I love that writing is meant, because it is true. It does take us on a story. It does make us grow as people and as readers. And yes, nonfiction is a very interesting avenue of storytelling, depending on what the story you're trying to write. But I definitely think nonfiction's purpose is to educate and enlighten, whereas fiction writing is like to educate, entertain, and enlighten, the three E's, which I think are very, very important, because you can learn a lot from fiction as you can from nonfiction. And it takes a lot of time to like really hone in those three specific E's into your storytelling. And so with that in mind, Greg, what authors would you say have been your role models in the sense of like how you present a story, weave different narratives, and just present a great story to the reader?
So many good authors. I'll mention a few, and then I'll go deep on one, I guess,
All right.
because certainly J.R.R. Tolkien and what he created, the story and the content has been hugely influential. I remember reading A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin when I was young, and being taken on a journey that was very different, also fantasy, and yet completely in a different style. Neil Gaiman just seems to be a great writer no matter what he is writing, horror or a kid's book,
Yes.
very literary, or horror kids book, as I just finished the Graveyard book. Um,
I remember
if
that
you
book.
Yeah, and if you like Norse myths, then read American Gods, because
Mm-hmm.
they're heavy in there. He also, side note, he does a great job of conveying the character of Odin, uh, in line with the way that character is portrayed in the myths, unlike many other more modern portrayals. But I
Mm-hmm.
think my biggest role model author would have to be Terry Pratchett,
Ooh,
because
okay.
such deceptively simple prose, which is much harder to write than is given credit for by a lot of people. Brilliantly crafted characters at the same time. Humor in the way he wrote about and what he chose to write about, but not the kind that he had to hit you over the head with. Um, it was there as a means of helping move that prose along. It was woven into the fabric of those stories in a way that seemed entirely appropriate, and made those stories helped make those stories come to life. But Pratchett was such an interesting guy beyond the fiction. If you read his nonfiction, there's at least one book of collected nonfiction, many of his speeches and nonfiction pieces. Also, he was an avid user of technology, and yet he could see a little further down the road than
Right.
others. You'll find, if you look not too hard, you find that there's a 1990s interview between him and Bill Gates, and he basically perceives how the internet will become this avenue of mass disinformation, to which Bill Gates is like, it'll be fine. So he's way ahead of his time, as
Mm.
many brilliant men are. He was an avid user of technology without being just a blind consumer of it. And he was really a guy to admire, if you, especially some of his later life things when he was talking about his dementia and you know, the right to end his life and how he wouldn't have that right and how other people wouldn't have that right. He wrote very convincingly about that. You can hear from Neil Gaiman, his friend, that actually he was not this, cute little old nice man necessarily. He was full of fury, and yet
Okay.
he was able to channel that into a prose that conducted the symphony of what he was trying to get across in the most effective way, and not just I don't think anybody would read his prose and get a sense, yeah, this was an angry guy. Now, maybe not angry is the wrong word, intense for sure. I'm not sure if you could conclude that either, but being able to channel that fury into something that didn't sound that way, but it was effective. I just think he's one of the greatest English writers of our time. I am still sad that he was taken early from us.
Wow. I've never, and I love asking this question because I learned so many different authors that inspire all of my guests. Because I mean, I've heard of Neil Gaiman, I've heard of Tolkien, Professor Tolkien, but I've never heard of the other one. So again, thank you for bringing that up. And it really is intriguing and really fascinating to see what really motivates an author, like what goes through their head to like push them to make these incredible prose, like the passion that goes into like taking like pain of any kind and channeling it through and making it in a way where you can't even tell, oh, okay, this was clearly written by a guy who's very angry or very passionate. That is very, very impressive and takes a lot of skill and a lot of dedication. And it also gathers in all these readers who were probably not the initial target audience for these authors, but they got them nonetheless, which is still very, very incredible. And so, kind of leading on the line, going to combine these two questions together, Greg. When you began writing Trolls Bane and Spear of the Gods series, did you write these books in the sense that these are the books that you wanted to read growing up, or did you write for this for an author in mind? And leading into that author side, do you have an ideal reader in mind, or not necessarily a picture perfect, but like the general characteristics?
I think the initial writing of it was definitely, and I still write this way, write the books that you would want to read. Write the books that you would want to read, and readers will find you. And if you, the other side of that coin is, if you write books that you don't necessarily want to read, but you think this will sell well, that just doesn't sit with me very well. I don't know that I could do that. I guess I've never tried. Certainly, there are more profitable things to be writing than
Right.
long form, heavily researched, as authentic as I can make it fantasy trilogy. So, but I don't want to do those other things necessarily. There are other projects I want to get onto after this, but they're largely still in the fantasy realm, and they're still books that I would want to read with characters that I would be interested in for various reasons. I think my ideal reader, yeah, like ask me in 3 years. I'm not sure about that. The best I can think of is like, are there people like me? I don't know. Are there not that many people like me? Am I just a weirdo? Or are there actually a lot? Actually, there are a lot of people who are interested in Vikings generally. I think I've benefited from that.
Right.
But are they interested in like going deep and learning more about that, or is it kind of like, yeah, I want a fantasy Viking. He's got random bits of fur and wielding an axe that's 3 times too big and wearing a
Yes.
helmet with horns. It's like, okay, so I'm not interested in that. I am interested in going deep on the way those stories were told, the reasons for telling those stories back in the day. I don't focus over much on weapons, armor, and fighting kit in general, but I do know enough that to make it at least not anachronistic, and to fold some of that into, because some things I'm not generally that interested in what people are wearing, and yet what people are wearing can often tell you what their social class is, and that tells you what they're part of their history. So that, to that extent, I do that. It's just that it's not my first motivation. My first motivation is about the storytelling.
Right. Fascinating. And I 100% definitely agree. So would it be kind of like a little tangent question? Would it be out of the realms of possibility to assume that Trollsbane and Burn to Bear in the Spirit of the Gods series, that it's kind of in a way, use the term historical fantasy, in the sense that these characters are based in the sense of like historical Scandinavia, but they're not truly to the extent of like, oh, these are like 100% 10th century Norse, 10th century Danes, Swedes. They share the same characteristics in terms of like the clothing, how they went about their daily lives, but it is true to itself a fantasy-based story.
Yeah, it's a fair question, and I think it's fair to call it historical fantasy, though I won't call it historical fantasy.
Right.
And the reason is I don't want to oversell. So first of all, there's some very good historical fantasy writers writing in this period, and they're doing a great job. That's not what I wanted to do, though. I wanted to write a fantasy trilogy, and it would just want to be based in that time and on that mythology. So there are some things like I'm willing to have a dragon and witches, but I will be damned if I put an anachronistic piece of armor in there for that time period. I'm also I try to be careful about the history of the language. You mentioned the runes at the beginning of the book.
Right.
So, in short, I'll give a summary. What I talk about is those older set of runes, the Elder Futhark.
Right.
This is not the alphabet of the Viking Age. This is a pre-Viking alphabet. The younger Futhark is what the Vikings would have carved runes in. But you have a shift around the same time, or a little bit before my setting happens, because I envision it early 8th century,
Right.
where it was coming away from that elder Futhar to the younger. Now, fantasy part, I'm saying that those elder runes were at that time just used for magic, and the other stuff was used for writing. Now, I'm taking some liberties here, and that's one of the reasons I don't want to talk about my novels as historical fantasy, because I don't want to pitch it as like you're going to learn straight history here, because I'm giving you some things that they're a little bit fudged, and some things are a little bit made up. I have Hrolf Kraki in the wrong century. If you've read Hrolf Kraki's saga, I do a few other things that are a little bit strange. Now, everything makes sense to me. I know why I diverged, and I know why I kept certain things very strict, and I think I have good reasons for all of that. But because I do take a bunch of these liberties, historical fantasy is not how I would describe it. It's tough. Genre and what people expect for genre is important. Some people would say this is epic fantasy, which I think is this big catch-all lately.
Right.
But some people would, and my first YouTube reviewer, Liam from Liam Sleepings, he described it as sword and sorcery, and I could see why, because the stakes in particular they're more personal. They are not world-ending stakes. The guy is not trying to save everybody from an evil lord who was born under the full moon at the right time, and everything's going to end if he doesn't go out and do his thing. but at the same time, it gets more epic as it goes, and I think epic fantasy focuses more on characters than sword and sorcery usually does. I would actually describe it as epic sword and sorcery, and maybe that means I would get hated on by two different sets of people, but I think it's a fair way to talk about it.
Nice. Very, very nice. And we're just nearing the end of the interview, Greg. So I'm going to ask you probably the last two questions before I get into the final ones. I'm going to what authors or people would you say have been your biggest support in this position, or say this moment in your life right now? And secondly, have you gotten validation from other indie authors who have read your book, they've left reviews, and have told to you or messaged you saying, you belong in this community? Because it's one thing to write a book and definitely get it out there. It's another thing entirely to have your peers and fellow authors tell you that this is the place where you belong.
Yeah, absolutely. I would have to say biggest supporter as far as authors is a fairly easy question because I've known Michael J. Sullivan and his wife Robin since 2008 when we were all part of the same writers group in Arlington, Virginia. And he was just breaking in to self-publishing. He had just gotten rights back from a small press for his first book, Crown Conspiracy. Those first 6 books are now 3 books, where each one is is 2 books each, and they're traditionally published. But he was self-published. He went traditionally published with a small press, got his rights back, self-published, which is where he had the real success, and then eventually that series went to another traditional publisher. But I've known Mike for a long time. We've talked as friends for a long time. His style isn't exactly mine, but I have learned quite a lot from him. First, I was learning about the business because he was telling me, well, this is how I was doing it with self-publishing, and I don't want to underrate Robin's role in all of this, because while he was doing the writing, Robin was doing the marketing, the publishing, the figuring out so many things that now so many of us indie writers are benefiting from. But now I've continued to learn a little bit more about prose from him. He actually runs a small writer's critique group that I'm part of to this day. So definitely more support from him and Robin than anybody else. But yeah, other writers since publication, for sure. I found it was interesting. My first real review was a booktuber, Liam, from Liam's Leapings. And Liam was an interesting reader because he knows all this. Like, he knows all the references I'm making. If I drop an old English word, he's like, yeah, I know what that is. And so somebody who gets all of the Easter eggs was liking it. And I was like, great. What about other folks? And another writers group I'm part of is with a YA fantasy writer, C.K. Sorens, and I met her at Indie Writers Conference, 20 Books to 50K, and she really enjoyed it. She was into Norse myths, but certainly, not quite to the same degree as Liam was, as far as knowing the historicity and being like, yeah, it sounds like we're in the early 8th century. And I'm like, I never actually said that, but you just knew it. So then there are also people who are total noobs to Norse myths and don't know any of the sagas and are also writing like, yeah, I really like this. There is a Rowdy Gearson, who's another author and a friend of mine, who wrote the Impudent Edda and the Scandinavian Aggressors. He writes more as a pure comedy, but he knows these myths better than anybody. He also speaks Swedish, so I again wasn't getting anything over on him as far as like under the radar. but he said, this is a real refreshing thing because so much of the Norse fantasy or Norse historical fiction that he had been reading was really, it was kind of negative. Like it was this trip into a dark pit of despair. Like I want to find the actual quote. Oh, he said, "Burden to bear is also not a super somber spiral down into the grim dark pit of despair, as a lot of other things, because they just get super serious and they're hyper focused on that." And I'm like, there was humor in this, So he really appreciated that as well, and I found a lot of support from the indie writer community as far as like not even necessarily reading Burden to Bear yet, but being interested in swapping, sharing wisdom basically about how we go about succeeding at this process of independent publishing. And so, yeah, in the past 6 months, 8 months, year, I've definitely felt like I've made a place for myself within the independent publishing community, and I feel really good about it because I like my colleagues.
Awesome. Awesome. And now we arrive at probably like the last important question, which is, Greg, with everything that you've learned in your own writer's journey, the people that you've met, and really formulating your identity as an author in the independent publishing community, what is your word of wisdom to indie authors out there who really want to get their foot in the door?
Get together and organize together. We are, we talk about being a community, but don't always necessarily act like a community. So one of the problems is writers have constantly been squeezed dry for profits, like as if we're the least important part of the whole
Yes.
equation. And it's like, you don't have an equation without us. And that needs to stop. And yet, continually, writers take bad deals from traditionally published or from traditional publishers, small presses, big presses. Uh, we sometimes they succeed, but don't share exactly how they succeed. Sometimes we succeed and we're like, yeah, I bought a bunch of Amazon ads and returned a whole big profit on that. I'm like, yeah, but is that sustainable for our industry? I think we need to get together and think, how are we going to approach this business, as it is a business, in the long term? How do we change the terms on which we can succeed, or by which we can succeed? Getting together and sharing that knowledge is the first step. And what I found is it works, because most of us really do want to share the things we've learned and help one another succeed. And that as some of us succeed, more of us succeed. And so it's much easier to do things like get questions answered, like, I'm not sure how to do this process of, turning my ebook into a print book, or I don't know what I should do. Like, can you review this prose for me and just be a reader, because I need a first reader. Like, this is it can be a lonely process, as you described earlier in the interview. People are
Right.
available for those things. And so get out there, talk to us, use us.
Incredible. And I truly 100% agree with everything that you said, Greg. And with that, listeners, we conclude this amazing interview with author Gregory Amato, Greg for short. Greg, thank you so much for joining us today. And before we officially end, is there any announcement that you would like to make to the listeners who want to know more about any projects that you have in the works, or any other writing tips that you have, or just where they can meet and engage with you?
So the easiest way to meet and engage is through my newsletter. If you go to my website, amatoauthor.com, which I think will also be in the comments, that's a that's an easy
Yes.
way to jump on my newsletter, get a couple of free stories, including Trollsbane, for nothing. And I send that usually twice a month. But you can always just email me if you want to interact, if you have a question, if you're wondering about breaking into that business. I like getting those emails. I'm happy to answer them, and directly through email is the best way to engage. Now, the thing that I really have going on right now is my Kickstarter for book 2 of the series, Rune to Ruin. Book 1 was Burden to Bear. Book 2 is Rune to Ruin. Book 3 will be Fall into Fury, and that I have a draft written for that, but it's not out yet. What you want to do is support the current Kickstarter for Burden to Bear and get those first 2 books, and then there will be another crowdfunding campaign for Fall into Fury later, and that will finish out the trilogy.
And I'll provide the Kickstarter link down below in this video description, as well in the comments to go and check it out. I will also link down Greg's website so you can reach out to him and also join up for his newsletter. And I'm also going to pin my double feature book impressions on this video as well towards the end right here, listeners. And please make sure to go out and support our fellow indie author, Greg Amato. It is an amazing book that Greg has made, and I wish him all success in his future endeavors. And with that, listeners, we conclude this wonderful interview officially. Again, I want to thank Greg for joining us today. Greg, thank you so much for joining us today.
Gabriel, thank you very much for having me on. I wish you continued success with both the YouTube channel and with your own self-publishing.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you very much. And with that, listeners, this concludes the Marches lineup. Be sure to check out my newsletter for April's, because I have a huge slew of authors that I'm really excited to showcase. And without further ado, until next time, this has been The Wandering Scribe and The Wandering Quill, signing out.